So my name is Rob Jacob. I'm in the Math and Computer Science Division at Argonne National Lab. Been there about 14 years, and I've been working on climate models the entire time. My background is I'm an atmospheric scientist. I study at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I just know just enough about programming to be dangerous. So, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we develop climate models in the climate modeling community. But first, you're going to need to know some climate modeling basics. So there's an old saying that goes that climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. What this means is that climate is just the average of weather. So if you were going to calculate the average high temperature for today, August 13th, you'd have to go back in time and find 30 August 13th high temperatures, add them all up, divide by 30. This 30 figure is kind of arbitrary. The legend is that that was the average length of a career. So you would spend your career assembling data for a place, and then at the end you would publish the climate of that place. And as we go forward in time, the 30-year period adjusts forward. The National Weather Service said recently, please note that we're going to update the climatological reference period from 71 to 2000 to 81 to 2010, because time has advanced on, and this 30-year window is advancing with us. So to model the climate system, what you really have to do is you have to model years and years of global weather. All right, so we're going to be giving you some climate model basics. Climate is what you expect. Weather is what you get. To model a climate system, you have to model years of global weather. So the weather that we see at any particular point on the globe is embedded in what we call the general circulation of the atmosphere, which is sketched out in this cartoon. You have where we are, you have prevailing winds from the west. Down in the tropics, you have prevailing winds from the easterly directions, and then again in the southern mid-latitudes. You have also in the vertical direction, which most people don't think about very much, you have these semi-permanent circulations, the Hadley cell in the tropics, Ferrel cell in the mid-latitudes, and a polar cell up in the poles. Here's the famous polar vortex. We've been using this term for years. It just refers to the convergence of the spinning of wind kind of around the pole. So in order to simulate weather over several years, you have to simulate this entire general circulation of the atmosphere. But you don't just have to simulate the atmosphere. You also have to simulate the ocean. The reason is that over the period of days to weeks, your atmospheric systems will move from land to ocean, and they get affected by what the ocean is doing. For example, here's a picture of the Gulf Stream taken from a satellite with the ocean water colored by temperature. You can see this huge amount of warm water being moved up the coast by the Gulf Stream current out here into the North Atlantic. And any weather system that passes over this is going to be affected greatly by that warm water. So its exact position and location and how much warm water is there and how warm it is, that's all very important in modeling the weather downstream of that. Sea ice is kind of the third major component of the climate system. Sea ice is very different from anything else in the climate system. You know, it's kind of a liquid, kind of a solid, depending on the forces that are acting on it. It insulates the ocean below it from further heat loss. It cools the atmosphere above it because it's so reflective. Any radiation that happens to get there gets reflected away immediately. And it changes its boundary over time. And it really, without sea ice, the poles look very, very different. And then finally, we have the part we're most familiar with, the land surface. So the biggest impact of the land surface from a global climate perspective is how reflective it is. You have very bright desert areas that reflect a lot of radiation. They are very cold during the night because of this. You have very dark vegetated surfaces that not only absorb heat, but also release moisture as the leaves and trees in these vegetated surfaces cool themselves. And that's a major input of moisture into the bottom of the atmosphere. So all of these aspects of the land surface have to be modeled as well. So this cartoon kind of shows how it all looks together. You have the ocean here, you have clouds in the atmosphere, you have clouds raining out either over the ocean or over the land surface, and you have exchanges of energy going on between all of these systems, energy and mass. So the tools that we use to model these components, especially the atmosphere and the ocean, have this general term. They're called a general circulation model. They solve what's called the primitive equations, which is what we call the primitive equations, a set of nonlinear PDEs which ultimately derive from the Navier-Stokes equations. But unlike the fluid in a pipe or fluid around an airplane wing that Navier-Stokes is typically used for, this is Navier-Stokes for a geophysical fluid. So a geophysical fluid is rotating, it's on a sphere, and it's acted upon by gravity. We also further assume that it's very thin and stratified. It's hydrostatic, so the vertical motions aren't really that important. On a global scale, that's true. And also things like we don't assume sound waves are important for the climate system, very small aspect ratio, and any motions are very shallow. And then we derive these equations on a non-inertial reference frame rotating with the Earth. And when you do that, you get a set that looks like this in spherical coordinates. You have your momentum equations for east-west wind and north-south wind. You have the advection term in spherical coordinates. This is the friction term in spherical coordinates. And this is the vertical friction. And this is just the expansion of this del squared term here. That's not all of them. Got to have another page. You have a continuity equation, the hydrostatic equation for the vertical motion. You need an equation of state. This happens to be the one for the ocean. It's a bit more complex than for the atmosphere. And you can also advect various tracers in the atmosphere or the ocean. This is the advection equation, and then there's a very complex forcing term here. There's a lot actually in that forcing term. It'd be really nice if the atmosphere and the ocean were just simple fluids that did nothing but nice fluid dynamic things, but they have lots of diabatic and non-fluid processes going on inside them, such as heat forcing. Radiation from the sun goes through the atmosphere and warms it up at every layer. It reflects off the bottom, and that reflected stuff also warms up the atmosphere. It'll hit a cloud, it'll warm the clouds warm up, they radiate and warm up the atmosphere around them. All of these processes have to be modeled as well. The equations for them look very different. They're not fluid dynamics. This is a long wave radiative flux in the 500 to 1500 centimeter band. This is just an example I'm throwing at you of some of the equations that constitute a climate model. So, of course, none of these things have analytical solutions. We have to solve them numerically. A numerical grid for the atmosphere might look something like this. This vertical scale is very exaggerated. The atmosphere covers the planet, which is tens of thousands of kilometers wide, but it's at most 10 kilometers thick. The part that we really care about is about 10 kilometers thick. So this vertical scale is not accurate here. So the pieces of an atmospheric general circulation model, we split these up into two pieces. The ones that call the primitive equations, this is our lingo. We call it the dynamics, the dynamical core, the dicore. These are the words you're going to hear if you spend any time in this business. The forcing terms, which is that F term on the tracers, include things like the change in temperature due to radiative transfer, the effects of clouds, the change in moisture due to cloud and rain formation. You have a major tracer, which is water vapor, changing its state in the middle of the atmosphere. It'll go from a gas to a liquid to a solid, back again. And change in temperature due to sensible heat transport through the boundary layer, latent heat release, friction with the surface. So the algorithms for all these, again, in our terminology, we refer to that as the physics or the column physics. Major groupings, you might have these long wave radiation, short wave radiation, boundary layer, deep convection, cloud fraction, gravity wave drag, all the things that aren't included in the approximations for the primitive equations. And these physics can take as much or more time as the dynamics, which is an important point to remember when considering climate model performance. So some of the atmospheric dynamic methods that we use, a very old one is called in this business the spectral transform method. Basically, you take your state variable and you represent it by a truncated series of spherical harmonic functions. That's a great choice because it's on a sphere, so spherical harmonic functions can represent a lot of the motion that goes on in the atmosphere. This gives you some very nice, easy to work with functions, the Legendre functions. This method is over 30 years old in this community. It's still widely used because you can get a really good answer for not a lot of computational costs. In the rest of the community, this is referred to as the Galerkin method with a spherical harmonic basis function. Finite volume methods are also used. It temporarily succeeded the spectral method recently, although it's on a longitude grid, which means you have a problem at the poles, you have a singularity. There are also cube sphere approaches. We're now transitioning to a finite element method in the community, because it shows very good scalability and performance. So that's just the atmosphere. Remember, we have 3 other pieces of the climate system we have to build a model for. The ocean general circulation model is very similar to an AGCM, except we have side boundaries. The atmosphere, you kind of ignore mountains, or you can get rid of them through a vertical coordinate transform. But you can't do that for the ocean. The ocean has a point where it ends and there's no more ocean on the side. And for this reason and others, ocean models are almost all finite difference, with the vertical coordinate just being z. There's not as much physics, that messy physics stuff that makes atmosphere models hard, not as much of that in the ocean. The motions are much slower, and the length scales are also shorter. It has a much higher heat capacity than the atmosphere. This is where the memory of the system lies for the climate model. When the climate is observed to have any kind of a time scale or power at things longer than a year, it's probably because of an interaction with the ocean. Here's an example of an ocean finite difference grid. What they did in order to get around, if you just use a latitude-longitude grid, you're going to have a singularity at the poles. Your time step is going to have to get really short. You're going to have to do something special. What they do here in this particular ocean model is they create a tripole grid. So they take the poles, basically, and instead of sticking the North Pole in the middle of the ocean, where it really is, they formulate this tripole formation where the poles are basically placed over land. The South Pole is in Antarctica, so that's fine. And the other North Poles are split into one in northern Canada and one in Siberia, so you don't have to worry about altering your time step. You do have to worry, however, about finding your way around this grid. So in sea ice models, they're kind of both, they have both tricky thermodynamics and tricky dynamics. For thermodynamics, you have to keep track of the formation of sea ice. Sea ice will appear where there wasn't any before. Ocean and atmosphere don't have that problem. It'll grow, it'll melt. How reflective it is, the albedo will change based on if it's dry or wet. You have melt ponds also affecting the albedo. The dynamics are very interesting. Sea ice can just be blown along by the wind or by the ocean currents. It can have internal stresses and strains. It can behave like a solid if it's packed up against each other or up against the shoreline. You can have ridging in ice sheets, and this will affect how thick it gets and how much it melts later in the summer. So this is a field unto itself. And then finally, the land surface. Now, the land surface, at least in current state of the art, although this is changing, doesn't have a lot of fluid dynamics in it. People mostly ignore rivers and groundwater transport and things like that. They're heavily parameterized, but it has a lot of complex physics, chemistry going on inside of it. For the various plants on the surface, the different heights lead to what's called a canopy layer model based on how high the tree canopy is, and you can have different stages of tree canopy in a given forest. So you have to keep track of vegetation composition, vertical heat transfer in soil, heat radiation transfer between the ground, the tree canopy, and the free atmosphere, the hydrology of the canopy, snow, soil moisture, and river runoff. Historically, this was actually just part of the column physics in the atmosphere model if you go back in time, and only recently has been, well, recently in the past 15 years, have been broken out into its own component. So here's this picture again. The The other part you have to worry about, you have each of the four components, but then they all got to talk to each other. They all have to communicate their boundaries to each other in order to calculate forces between them, such as evaporation from the land and the atmosphere, from the land and the ocean up to the atmosphere. Precipitation then, the atmosphere rains back down on the land or the ocean surface. You have heat fluxes, both sensible heat and latent heat, and then you also have momentum fluxes between the surface. So this is the job of what's called the coupler, kind of a fifth component of a climate model. And an example of what it might have to do is it'll have to merge all these surface temperatures. Every one of these models is calculating its own temperature surface on its grid, and you need to be able to merge these and interpolate and average them together in order to give the atmosphere model one unified picture of what the surface looks like. So that was a brief crash course in climate modeling. Now, how does the climate community build a coupled model? Well, so coupled climate models are almost never written from scratch, as you might guess. They use existing atmosphere and ocean models that the members of those communities have put together for their purposes. So the source code for each component is usually developed separately as a standalone model. It'll have a different coding style, a different convention. It'll have different internal data structures. Usually they weren't intended to output their boundary data, at least not as frequently as is necessary. You can always count on the fact that they're written in Fortran, though. That's almost a given. That's at least the lingua franca. One of the things that we've developed at Argonne to help make this coupling of climate models a bit easier is something called the Model Coupling Toolkit. What MCT does is it provides classes and methods to handle most of the routine tasks of building a parallel coupler. Basically, it provides wrappers data types that you can use as a translation between the individual data types of each component. And it also provides methods for doing the data transfer in an efficient and parallel way. So one result of this community effort is the NSF DOE coupled climate model, which was called CCSM, the Community Climate System Model. It recently changed its name to the Community Earth System Model, version 1. It has the four basic components that I mentioned. These names in parentheses are their specific names, like CAM is the Community Atmosphere Model, POP is the Parallel Ocean Program, Community Land Model, Community Sea Ice Model. And these numbers here are the typical grid size resolutions, the first two being horizontal and the last one being the vertical number of grid points. And I think this is averaging, this is like about a little more than 1 degree. This is somewhere around 1 degree of latitude. And that's still kind of state of the art for climate modeling. So the way that CSM manages itself is there's a scientific steering committee that sets goals in major development and kind of monitors progress. Advising this committee is a community advisory board consisting of professors from universities and scientists from laboratories, not just from NSF and DOE, but from NASA and from NOAA. And then the real activity happens in the CSM working groups. You have basically one for every major model that I talked about. And then you also have working groups for kind of subcomponents of the model, like biogeochemistry, chemistry and climate, ones for applications like paleoclimate and climate change. There's also one group for doing all the software engineering of a model, and I'm currently the co-chair of this one. These groups meet twice a year, at least. Everyone meets together at the CESM workshop in June in Breckenridge. There might be 300 to 400 attendees there. That's not the entire user base, because this might just be the professors and maybe a postdoc or two. There's still grad students and other folks at home using this model. This is the website where you can find out all you want to know about it. It's freely available. You just have to kind of fill out a little, what do you want to do with it, and give them your email form, and you can download it. It's used worldwide because of that. It's one of the few state-of-the-art global climate models that just gives itself away, gives the code away for free. So a little bit more about the model development. So each submodel has a group of expert users and developers from that discipline. You can spend a lifetime learning how to build an ocean model. It's not going to tell you how to build an atmosphere model, not necessarily. Since the climate is created by the intersection of these systems, collaboration was required early on. The first workshop was way back in '96. And the realization that you have to couple these models in order to advance the science was well before that. The introduction of new code is not really a formal process. Typically, you have to adapt to the data structures already in place. There's these informal bake-offs that the working groups conduct to determine if two algorithms, say for cloud processes, behave better or not. The working groups are steered by co-chairs. They eventually reach a consensus through this uneven scientific method on new schemes. For example, they recently replaced the deep convection scheme in the atmosphere. They upgraded the ocean model. They replaced the boundary layer scheme in the atmosphere. And inside of NCAR, NCAR is the National Center for Atmospheric Research, they kind of lead the software engineering of the model and coordinate, provide kind of a coordination place for all this development. But membership of these working groups is open to anyone. You kind of like any open source project, you get your contributions in by kind of proving your worth. You have a good idea, it's coded well, you can present the reasons and the results correctly, and eventually it gets accepted. So the climate model construction is very similar in other centers that follow completely different software engineering methods or don't have any kind of a community group. This is from some work by Caitlin Alexander and Steve Easterbrook, who studied just the source code. They were just looking at the source code of several different climate models. And in this figure, the ovals are roughly proportional to the code size. As you can see, the atmosphere model tends to dominate in terms of code complexity because there's the most stuff going on there physically, so naturally it would have the most code in it. The choices that they make on how to hook the pieces together and communicate data is a little different depending on the model. Here in the Hadley Center, which is an English group, they've chosen to keep their land model as part of their atmosphere model. It's not broken out into a separate component. Different choices. So a little bit about parallelism and performance in climate models. Nearly all the components in CESM are hybrid parallel. They use MPI and OpenMP. So load balancing CESM is really hard because there's 4 components. Each one of them can have different MPI and OpenMP settings, number of MPI tasks, number of OpenMP threads. 100-year simulation can still take weeks of wall clock time, even on a computer like Mira. So all climate models can read, write checkpoint files. They call them restart files. Domain decomposition is the usual parallel method. Threads will handle various blocks of atmospheric columns, and then you can allocate several blocks per MPI task, and you can adjust how many blocks per OpenMP thread to fit the cache if you want to. The performance, though, tends to be very flat. There's no single kernel to optimize and really hammer on that will vastly increase your simulation speed. There's been some use of GPUs. For example, a case where there's a lot of tracers, like say 100 tracers. If you're doing an atmospheric chemistry simulation, you have to include, CO2 is usually there anywhere, but CO2 and methane, and you want to include all these chemistry species in your simulation. You want them to be advected along with everything else. You can take that code and put it on a GPU and see some benefit. So how do we validate these climate models? Well, we validate them against data. So if you take your coupled climate model and you run it for 100 years, and say you have a time step of about 20 minutes, which is typical. So on an older version of this model, you'd get like a quadrillion operations per simulated year, let's say. And after 100 quadrillion operations, what do you know about the climate? You don't know anything. The reason of that is because what I said earlier about climate being the average of weather. These 100 quadrillion operations are calculating this, are giving you this time series of weather events across the globe. And now you have to go back and calculate averages and moments and figure out what the climate actually was. So you calculate statistics on the climate model output, averages over time and space. You can take other moments. You can do more sophisticated things like canonical correlation analysis, principal component analysis. And then you compare against calculations done with observations. Since running the model is very expensive and the science comes from analyzing the output in this kind of simple way, climate models typically output everything. They output All these prognostic state variables, tons of derived quantities. There might be 100 different variables in a single file from a climate model. Only a few of them are 3D, and that would be like the wind field, the moisture field, the temperature field. There's a lot of two-dimensional and one-dimensional fields in that count of 100. And we learned long ago not to try to save everything for every time step. The climate models have never done that. There's never been enough disk space or whatever to hold it all. We typically average up the time steps as it's going, and we'll output just a monthly average. Some variables might be output on a daily or a 4-hourly average, or maybe it'll be a snapshot, but it's never every time step. So if we want to validate our model, we have to validate it against observations. We have to measure our climate system, and that's not very easy. Ideally, our observations would cover the whole planet from the bottom of the ocean to the top of the atmosphere, because that's the domain our climate model covers. Need to measure all those variables, the 100-odd variables we're outputting. We have to take measurements for decades, because it's the climate. It's several years of weather. And we don't really come close to meeting all these goals. Also, we have a problem if we only have one climate to measure. We don't have a bunch of them. We can only measure one of them. But we do have some pretty impressive, well-coordinated efforts to do this. In DOE, and Argonne has a role in this, there's the Atmospheric Radiation Measurement Program. What they do is they maintain this site in mostly centered in Oklahoma, and they fill it with all these instruments that are taking measurements 24/7. And they've been in place for like about 10 years. So as various storm systems and other weather and clouds and other weather events pass over this area, all these instruments, and there's also satellites looking down, can tell us what's happening, and we can use those observations to understand how well our climate model is doing. For the ocean, there's a project known as the Argo project, which fills the ocean, and here's a map showing you how filled. Each dot represents one of these little floating buoys, and these buoys are programmed to fill themselves with water, descend, move along the ocean for a few days, measuring, being affected by the current, measuring temperature as they go. Then they say, okay, time to go up, and they ascend, measuring the profiles of temperature and salinity as they go, and then they radio all that back to a satellite, which sends it back to a collection point. This is an amazing data set, but it's only been in operation for a few years. And we need this to operate for decades in order to get a good picture of what's happening in the ocean. Satellites are great. They give you global coverage, but they've only been in operation for a few years. Typically, individual satellites are especially only in operation for a few years, and they can only tell you what's happening mostly in 2D. You can back out some 3D information, but then you kind of get this data model dependency going on that's difficult to work with. So when we have our data, and we have our data from observations, and we have our data from the climate models, and we want to compare them together, what kind of plots do we make? Well, we typically make a lot of 2D and 1D plots. And the reason for that is what I mentioned earlier, is that the atmosphere and the ocean have a very, very small aspect ratio. It's 10,000 kilometers wide and about 10 kilometers deep. So you throw this at some 3D software package, and it's going to show you this little strip that's about a few pixels tall. And you're not going to be able to really see anything. And also this is how scientists kind of learn about the atmosphere too. It's how they're used to looking at it. So you might typically see a picture like this. Here is, I believe, what is that? That's sea level pressure from a model and from observations, and then the difference. Climate scientists spend a lot of time looking at plots like this. And then you can also reduce things to one dimension. This is a vertical profile from the surface up to the top of the model, and then temperatures along the bottom here. And we're comparing observations in dots and the model output in the red line here. And then we kind of squint at these differences here and these differences here, and we think about what might be causing them, and we go back and we try to modify our model to do a little better. Sometimes the data comes into question too, and we find a mistake in the data. So the analysis of these climate models is also a community activity. We do use standard programs like MATLAB and Mathematica and Matplotlib, but a lot of them don't have the specialized functions and map projections that climate scientists need. So over the years, the same institution, NCAR, has developed something they call the NCAR command language. It's a scripting language. It's sort of Python-like, but it predates Python. One of the things that it does is it had hundreds of built-in analysis functions that climate scientists care about. It can read all kinds of file types that satellite products and model products come out in. It's a community-based tool, widely used by CSM developers. Again, the binaries and source are also available. The guys that develop it conduct workshops, and it's a pretty big code base, but it is possible to develop your own analysis algorithms and share them with people. That happens a lot. And then more community work. One of those working groups I mentioned, in this case, the Atmospheric Model Working Group, will go through and using this language, write tons of analysis scripts that will look at the climate model output and look at some data and generate plots for you. So really all you have to do is point this script at your output and you get all of these plots generated for you. Some of them you're going to look at a lot, some of them you're going to ignore. It depends kind of on what your interest is as a scientist. And generating these plots can sometimes take a few hours out of your day just to generate all of them. So let me move towards the end here by talking about climate model applications. The main application for climate models, no big surprise, is climate change. That's why there is a field called climate modeling and why it employs me and several thousand other people. We've observed that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has gone up over several years, not just in the most famous place, Mauna Loa, Hawaii, but also in Barrow, Alaska, and really anywhere that you measure CO2 for a long time, you see this rise. We know from very simple physics that carbon dioxide is a very strong absorber of the radiation that passes through the atmosphere. And so if it's increasing by this huge amount, we're going to expect it to alter how the atmosphere distributes heat with itself, and then that's going to change the temperature structure of the atmosphere. So one of the main applications of climate models is to understand how exactly this happens and how bad it's going to get. So what people will do is they'll take their climate models, and remember there's several of these around the planet, and they occasionally get together and have these little intercomparison projects where all of the models will run the same problem. In this case, all the models tried to simulate the 20th century. This is a great case because we know what happened. Our instrument record is pretty good. We know how the forcing changed in the 20th century. We know how the CO2 went up, how other chemical species changed. So you can prescribe all of that in your model as a forcing boundary condition. You can run them, everything other than that, everything is unforced, and you just let the model evolve over time, over the 100 years, and you compare it against observations. So this spread of orange curves here, these are several different models, all trying to simulate the 20th century. The black curve is observations. This is temperature anomaly. So this is the departure from the global annual average. The red line then is the multi-model average. And the multi-model average does pretty well. These sharp spikes, these sharp downward spikes here are major volcanic eruptions that temporarily cool the planet until all the sulfate they emit falls out. And what we see is that the models do a pretty good job of following what the atmosphere actually did. You don't see this orange curve going down like this or going flat like that. We can then do experiments about what's going to happen in the future. So you start off with your 20th century run, and then you posit several possible future CO2 rises. And you do the same thing. You ask all the models to try the same experiment. So 17 models, you try doing this CO2 curve. 21 models, they're going to try doing this CO2 curve, and so on. Different models do different lengths of experiment and different times of the experiment. These are different CO2 scenarios, with the most mild one being this constant composition, meaning right around now we'd agree to stop emitting all CO2 ever. And these other scenarios are various curves of CO2 based on whether or not we do a good job of limiting its release. And they all show that the climate is going to be surface warming, the departure from average is going to continue to go up. That's the global average, but you see the same picture if you look on a smaller regional scale. So in this particular experiment, we're seeing, instead of averaging over the globe, they're averaging over these continental regions, and they're comparing in red the model average for the actual CO2 curve. Black is observation, and then blue is what happened, because you can do this in the model. What happens if you didn't increase the CO2 over the 20th century? We can't do that experiment in the real climate. We only have one of them, and we can't really go back in time, but we can do it in our model. And so these blue curves are kind of what the suite of models did if you don't increase CO2, and none of them match the observations. So a few future considerations about climate modeling. We are always trying to push for more resolution in our models. It should be for obvious reasons. If you're trying to model something that's basically a fluid, you want as much resolution as possible to get all the details of that fluid. These are various resolutions for that old spectral transform method. This was state of the art, like around late 90s, middle of 2000s. We got to here. We're now almost up to here in the present day, but it's still really hard to do a 100-year 20th century run at this kind of resolution. This kind of resolution is very experimental. There's maybe a handful of runs in the entire world that have been done for several decades at this kind of resolution. But it's important because regional details are extremely important to things we care about in the future climate. For example, here's what happened to the Petermann Glacier in Greenland. It looked like this on July 28th, 2010, and just a few days later, a big chunk of it had broken off. The forces driving this kind of glacier collapse are very localized. They depend a lot on what's happening in the ocean right outside this little fjord, and also what's happening in the atmosphere right around this outlet. So if you want to understand and predict these kind of things, you're going to need extremely high resolution. Hurricanes is another thing we want to know about for the future of the climate. We want to know if they're going to change in intensity, if they're going to change in frequency. In order to do that, you need to have a high resolution, because hurricanes are very small structures relative to the global climate. And if you have high enough resolution, they will create, just by the natural physics of the system, they will spontaneously arise and follow the typical path. These are tropical cyclone tracks from 85 to 2005, colored by max wind speed from weak to red, from weak blue to red strong, and we're very interested to know how these kind of statistics are going to change into the future. Some of the ways we're doing this is you could just increase the resolution everywhere, but that's very expensive. There is a lot of work, theoretical work being done to look at regionally refined grids, where you take something like, this is the cube sphere, and you just refine a portion of it around an area like that ARMS site in Oklahoma, where you have a lot of data. That'll help you to understand how well your climate model is doing. The nice thing about these grids is that they have the same dynamics throughout. Another way that this is done is by nesting one model inside of another, but that typically has some problems at the boundaries. So I'm going to finish up by mentioning a new project in the Department of Energy called ACME, the Accelerated Climate Model for Energy. The CESM model that I mentioned earlier has for many years been developed as a partnership between DOE and NSF, but the kind of the structure that the CESM is organized under makes it very hard to take the entire model and move it in one direction, which is what DOE has to do when it starts thinking about exascale. In order to move this model to exascale, and in order to address DOE problems, we decided we're going to need kind of a bit more of a top-down government structure for the model. So this is still a community, but it's a slightly smaller community of like 100 people or so scattered around the labs. This project just started a month ago. We branched off from the Community Earth System model, and everything we do, we're going to release back to the community in 2017. We're focused on these ultra-high resolutions. We want to make them more routine and more possible to do. We're focusing also on the period from roughly 1970 to 2050, because you have lots of good data here, and there's not so much disagreement on what CO2 is going to do in this time period. So this is a project you'll hopefully be hearing more about. It's one I'm heavily involved in. Yeah, I think that's all I had, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
So how do you input a lot of the data, like vegetation and canopy? Do you get that from the satellites?
Yeah, it's a combination of satellites and observations, and they'll typically be condensed down into either either one data set that you kind of use as an average, or some people, they might actually have a time series of data sets to show how they changed over time, if you're interested in that.
And human-wise, is it hard to import all of these different datas into your model?
I would say yes. The gathering of that data is very hard. Once it's been gathered, it's usually just converted into a common file format that these models know how to use. And there are tools to put it. If you have a different grid, there are tools to regrid it to whatever numerical grid you happen to be using. But the initial gathering of the data, yeah, that's extremely labor intensive. Yeah.
So for the plot that you had comparing a bunch of models against the past century of climate data, how many of those are first principles, and how many of them rely on the empirical data that you're comparing?
Well, nearly all of them are first principles in the sense that they're all based on those primitive Navier-Stokes equations. So they're just forced from the observed boundary conditions. Now, a lot of the physics parameterizations have free parameters in them, and those have to be tuned often. And there is some tuning to observations. Like, for example, you want to make sure that the net radiation at the top of the atmosphere is in balance before you start increasing the CO2 or something like that. And you do have to be careful that you're not tuning to the thing that you're trying to match. But there are ways to account for that.
Have you done a scalability study for CESM?
Scalability, yes. I didn't have that plot with me, but we can run on the entire machine of Mira, especially at the high resolution. Like if your resolution is a 1/4 degree of latitude or an 1/8 degree of latitude. That's true for the atmosphere model. The other components are not as scalable. And there are various reasons for that, mostly because it's either too much communication. Yeah, that's usually the case. Okay, yeah.
I'm just curious, so for future predictions, I assume that sun's activity might be actually important for what happens with the atmosphere. Any plans for the space physics community to collaborate with the weather community in that regard?
There is some collaboration in that area, yeah, especially in the space weather. And there are people talking about the coupling of the mesosphere and the thermosphere to the rest of the ionosphere and all that, yeah. But it's something that's barely been done. Those communities are just starting to talk to each other. Yeah.
Do you input your data dynamically into your model and tune the parameters according to it, or you start with that and go the whole simulation?
Typically, for climate, you just start at the beginning and you just let your simulation go. For weather, they do that kind of tuning that you're talking about. They do data assimilation for weather forecasting because you want to tune your parameters so that they give the best initial condition. But that doesn't happen as much in climate. Okay. And back there, I think was the question.
Yeah, so are the 4 components running concurrently and exchanging data and time? Is that how this executes?
Yeah, so I just realized I have to repeat the question. So the question was if the 4 components are executing concurrently and exchanging data. Yes, they are. You can actually, CSM lets you kind of play around with that sequencing. You can have them execute concurrently. You can have a few of them execute in sequence. And it's all done kind of very ad hoc. And there's not a lot of good theory for what different choices do to the numerical stability or the order of accuracy of the solution.
If I could follow up, is it necessary to operate them at equivalent timescales, or can they subcycle independently?
So the other question was if it's necessary for them to operate at the same time scales, or can they subcycle? They can subcycle, yes. Yeah. And that does happen, like the atmosphere will subcycle over the ocean. Okay, yeah.
temporally, you've shown that volcanoes can have a big impact. Do you take that one into account for future predictions?
So the question was, how do you account for volcanoes in future predictions? Yes, there are some statistical models you can use to kind of get a projected volcanic future activity, and there are some simulations that include that. Yeah.
And the differences are significant, or?
They don't bend the trajectory down, if that's what you're asking, but they produce those temporary cold spikes. Okay, so do we have to finish up? Yeah.
Before we break. I'm sort of curious as the ACME effort's getting started, right? You're focusing really on bringing these models to a much larger scale. Is the effort split between pushing the models to get better physics to work at these scales, or are you focusing more on architectural performance?
So the question was for the ACME effort, are we working more on physics for these high resolutions or performance? And the answer is a little of both, with the physics probably getting more attention, because it is an Office of Science Biological and Environmental Research initiative, and they're interested in science first. And
How much do you think the models will have to change?
from what I hear, they're going to have to change a lot.